What happens when a man who has spent his entire life serving others suddenly realizes that everything he believed in was built on lies? What would make someone who never shows weakness break down in front of the very people he's supposed to lead? Charles Morrison had always been the rock of Millfield Council. For 15 years, he walked into that chamber with his head held high, his voice steady, his convictions unshakable. He was the man people called when their problems seemed impossible to solve. He was the councilman who stayed late, who answered every phone call, who never missed a meeting even when his own world was falling apart. But on that cold Tuesday evening in March, something happened that no one saw coming. The man who had weathered every political storm, who had faced down angry crowds and hostile media, who had been threatened and praised in equal measure, did something that shocked everyone in that room. He cried. Not just a few tears, but the kind of raw, heartbreaking sobs that come from a soul that has been completely shattered. And as he walked toward that door for the last time, the words he whispered were barely audible, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of disappointment, betrayal, and broken dreams. It's over. But what led to this moment? What could possibly break a man who seemed unbreakable? The answer lies in a story that began long before that terrible night. A story of trust betrayed, friendships destroyed, and the devastating price of standing up for what's right in a world that rewards those who look the other way. This is that story. Charles Morrison adjusted his tie for the third time as he sat in his car outside the Millfield Community Center. The building looked the same as it had for the past 15 years, with its red brick walls and large windows that let the warm light spill out onto the parking lot. But tonight felt different. Tonight, everything was about to change, though Charles didn't know it yet. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the passenger seat, the same one his wife Sarah had given him when he first ran for council all those years ago. Back then, she had kissed him goodbye at the door and told him to make the community proud. Now, she barely looked up from her book when he left for meetings. The distance between them had grown so gradually that Charles sometimes wondered if he had imagined the closeness they once shared. Walking toward the building, Charles nodded to Mrs. Adnes Henderson, who was heading to her car after the senior center's bingo night. She smiled and waved, the same warm greeting she had given him since he was a boy growing up on Elm Street. These were his people, the neighbors who had watched him graduate high school, get married, buy his first house 3 blocks from where he grew up. They trusted him to represent their interest, to be their voice in local government. Inside the community center, the familiar smell of coffee and old carpeting greeted him. The meeting room was already filling up with the usual crowd. There were the regular attendees who came to every council meeting, clipboard-wielding citizens who kept detailed notes and asked pointed questions. There were the business owners who showed up when agenda items affected their bottom line, and scattered throughout were the faces Charles had come to know well over his years of service. Margaret Chen, the librarian, sat in her usual spot in the 3rd row. She had been fighting for increased library funding for months, armed with statistics about literacy rates and community engagement. Next to her sat Tom Bradley, the owner of Bradley's Hardware, who was concerned about the proposed changes to downtown parking regulations. These were the people who made Millfield work, Charles thought. They cared about their community, showed up, participated in democracy at its most basic level. Council members were already taking their seats at the long table at the front of the room. David Walsh, the council president, was reviewing his notes, his silver hair perfectly styled as always. David had been Charles's friend since college, the best man at his wedding, the godfather to his daughter Emma. They had entered politics together, driven by the same idealistic vision of making their hometown a better place for everyone. Next to David sat Jennifer Martinez, the newest member of the council. She had been elected just 6 months ago on a platform of transparency and fiscal responsibility. Her campaign had been energetic and well-funded, with glossy mailers that promised to bring fresh ideas to local government. Charles had supported her candidacy, believing that new perspectives would strengthen the council's ability to serve the community. Rita Kowalski occupied the seat at the far end of the table. Rita had been serving on the council longer than anyone except Charles himself. She was a former teacher who had transitioned into politics after retirement, bringing with her a no-nonsense approach to problem-solving and a deep knowledge of the community's history. Rita had been Charles's ally on many issues over the years, particularly when it came to education funding and senior services. The 5th council member, Michael Torres, was running characteristically late. Michael was younger than the others, a local attorney who specialized in real estate law. His connection to the development community sometimes put him at odds with other council members, but Charles respected his legal expertise and his ability to explain complex regulatory issues to the public. As Charles took his seat, David called the meeting to order. The first part of the evening proceeded as usual, with the approval of previous meeting minutes, reports from various department heads, and public comment on non-agenda items. Mrs. Patterson spoke about potholes on her street. A group of parents advocated for new playground equipment at Riverside Park. The head of the local Chamber of Commerce provided an update on the Summer Festival Planning Committee. Charles listened to each speaker with the attention he had always given to public comment. He took notes, asked clarifying questions, and assured speakers that their concerns would be given proper consideration. This was the part of council service he enjoyed most, the direct connection with citizens who took the time to participate in their local government. But as the evening progressed toward the more substantial agenda items, Charles began to notice something that made him increasingly uncomfortable. There seemed to be a coordination between some of his fellow council members that he hadn't been made aware of. David and Jennifer exchanged meaningful glances when certain topics came up. Rita nodded at specific moments as if responding to predetermined cues. Even Michael, who had arrived halfway through public comment, seemed to be following some script that Charles hadn't been given. The first major agenda item was a proposal to rezone a large parcel of land on the eastern edge of town. The property had been agricultural for generations, owned by the Hoffman family, who had farmed it since the 1940s. The proposal would change the zoning to allow for commercial and residential development, opening the door for a major shopping center and housing complex. Charles had reviewed the proposal carefully in the weeks leading up to the meeting. The development would bring jobs and tax revenue to Millfield, benefits that the community desperately needed. The town's manufacturing base had been shrinking for years, and young families were moving to neighboring communities that offered better shopping and entertainment options. On paper, the rezoning made sense, but Charles also knew that the Hoffman family had been pressured to sell their land for months. Real estate developers had made increasingly aggressive offers, and there had been rumors of intimidation tactics. The family's patriarch, old Heinrich Hoffman, had told Charles privately that he didn't want to sell, that the land had been in his family for 3 generations. But Heinrich was in his 80s, his health was failing, and his children lived in other states. The pressure to sell was becoming overwhelming. During the council discussion, David presented the rezoning as a straightforward economic development opportunity. He cited studies showing the positive impact of the proposed shopping center on local employment and tax revenues. Jennifer added her support, emphasizing the need for Millfield to compete with neighboring communities for retail dollars and young families. Rita, who Charles expected might have concerns about losing agricultural land, instead focused on the potential benefits for senior citizens. The proposed development included a medical center and pharmacy that would be more convenient for elderly residents than the current options in the town center. Michael provided legal context, explaining that the rezoning process had followed all required procedures and that the environmental impact studies had found no significant concerns. He noted that the developers had agreed to several community benefit provisions. As the discussion continued, Charles realized that he was the only council member expressing any reservations about the proposal. He raised questions about the long-term impact on the community's character, the loss of agricultural land, and the fairness of the pressure that had been applied to the Hoffman family. His colleagues listened politely to his concerns, but their responses felt rehearsed, as if they had anticipated his objections and prepared their answers. When the vote was called, Charles found himself in the uncomfortable position of being the sole dissenting voice. The rezoning was approved by a vote of 4-1, with Charles casting the only no vote. As the gavel came down, he looked around the table at his fellow council members. People he had worked with for years, people he considered friends. But tonight, they felt like strangers. The second major agenda item was a proposal to privatize the town's waste management services. Currently, waste collection was handled by the Public Works Department, with town employees driving town-owned trucks and serving all residents for a flat fee included in their property taxes. The privatization proposal would transfer these services to Precision Waste Management, a regional company that promised to reduce costs while maintaining service levels. Charles had concerns about this proposal as well. Privatizing waste management would mean laying off 12 full-time public works employees, many of whom had been with the town for decades. These were people Charles knew personally, neighbors who lived in the same community they served. The promised cost savings seemed modest when weighed against the human cost of eliminating good-paying jobs with benefits. Moreover, Charles had done some research on precision waste management and discovered that the company had a mixed track record in other communities. There had been complaints about missed collections, inadequate customer service, and gradual increases in fees after initial lowball bids. The company's owner, Robert Kellerman, had donated generously to Jennifer Martinez's campaign, a connection that Charles found troubling. Once again, Charles found himself standing alone against his fellow council members. David argued that privatization was necessary to control costs and improve efficiency. Jennifer presented detailed financial projections showing long-term savings for taxpayers. Rita expressed sympathy for the affected employees but insisted that the town's fiscal health had to be the top priority. Michael addressed legal questions about the transition process and contract terms. The debate was more heated than the previous item, with several residents speaking during public comment to express concerns about job losses and service quality. But when the vote was taken, the result was the same. 4 in favor, 1 opposed, with Charles again casting the lone dissenting vote. As the meeting moved toward its conclusion, Charles felt a growing sense of unease. 2 major decisions had been made tonight, decisions that would significantly impact the community, and he had been completely isolated in his opposition. This wasn't how the council had operated during his 15 years of service. Disagreements were common, but total isolation was not. Usually there was at least one other member who shared his concerns, even if they ultimately voted differently. The final agenda item was routine, a renewal of the contract for the town's legal services. Charles expected this to pass without controversy as it had in previous years. The town's attorney, Susan Walsh, was David's sister-in-law and had served in the role competently for over a decade. Her fees were reasonable, and there had never been any complaints about her work. But as Jennifer introduced a motion to put the legal services contract out for competitive bidding, Charles realized that the evening surprises weren't over. Jennifer argued that it had been too long since the town had solicited proposals from other legal firms, and that competitive bidding would ensure taxpayers were getting the best value for their money. Charles was puzzled by this sudden concern about competitive bidding, especially since Jennifer had just voted to approve a sole source contract with Precision Waste Management without requiring competitive bids from other waste management companies. The inconsistency was glaring, and Charles pointed it out during the discussion. David seemed uncomfortable with this agenda item, and Charles noticed that he abstained from the discussion entirely, citing his family relationship with the current attorney. Rita and Michael both supported the competitive bidding proposal, arguing that it was simply good governance to periodically review service contracts. The vote was 3 in favor, 1 opposed, with 1 abstention. Charles cast the dissenting vote, arguing that Susan Walsh had served the town well, and that there was no evidence of any problems with her performance that would justify the time and expense of a bidding process. As the meeting adjourned, Charles gathered his papers slowly, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 2 hours, the council had approved the rezoning of the Hoffman Farm, voted to privatize waste management services, and decided to put the town's legal services contract up for competitive bidding. 3 significant decisions, and Charles had been on the losing side of all of them. What bothered him most wasn't the fact that his positions hadn't prevailed. He had been outvoted before, and he understood that democracy meant accepting the will of the majority. What troubled him was the feeling that these decisions had been made before tonight's meeting, that his fellow council members had coordinated their positions without including him in the discussion. As people began filing out of the meeting room, David approached Charles with what seemed like forced casualness. They had been friends for over 20 years, and Charles could usually read David's moods easily. Tonight, David seemed nervous, almost guilty. "Tough night," David said, adjusting his tie. "But I think we made some good decisions for the community." Charles looked at his old friend, searching his face for some sign of the person he had known since college. Did we, or were these decisions made somewhere else and tonight was just theater for the public Packard? David's expression hardened slightly. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Charles. We had thorough discussions about all these items." "Did we? Because I don't remember any discussion with me. I don't remember anyone asking for my input before tonight. I felt like I was reading from a different script than the rest of you." "Maybe you're overthinking things," David replied, but his tone suggested he knew exactly what Charles was talking about. Sometimes the right decisions are obvious to most people. Jennifer Martinez had been standing nearby, apparently listening to their conversation. She approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Charles, I hope there are no hard feelings about tonight. We're all trying to do what's best for Millfield." Charles studied the newest council member, remembering how enthusiastic he had been about her candidacy just months ago. "Are we? Because I'm starting to wonder whose interests we're really serving." The comment hung in the air between them, and Charles realized that he had crossed a line. These were his colleagues, people he had to work with for the remainder of his term. Alienating them wouldn't help him serve the community more effectively. "I should get home," Charles said, picking up his briefcase. "Sarah's waiting up for me." It was a lie. Sarah hadn't waited up for him in months. She went to bed at 10 o'clock every night, whether he was home or not. Their relationship had become a series of polite exchanges about schedules, household maintenance, and their daughter Emma's college plans. The passion that had once defined their marriage had faded so gradually that Charles sometimes wondered if he had imagined it. As he walked to his car, Charles replayed the evening's events in his mind. Something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of the council, and he wasn't sure how or why. For 15 years, he had prided himself on being an effective representative for his constituents. He had built coalitions, found compromises, and worked collaboratively with his colleagues to address the community's needs. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of something that might force him to choose between his loyalty to his colleagues and his obligations to the people who had elected him. As he drove home through the quiet streets of his neighborhood, Charles had no idea how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. The porch light was on when he pulled into his driveway, but the rest of the house was dark. Sarah had left it on for him, a small gesture of consideration that reminded him of better times in their marriage. He sat in his car for a moment, looking at the house where he had lived for 12 years, where he and Sarah had raised their daughter, where they had once been happy. Inside, the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Charles poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen sink, looking out at the backyard where Emma had played as a child. She was a junior in college now, studying environmental science at the state university. She came home for holidays and summer breaks, but her life was increasingly separate from theirs. Charles thought about calling Emma, just to hear her voice and remind himself of what was really important. But it was after midnight, and she had classes in the morning. Instead, he climbed the stairs quietly, trying not to wake Sarah. As he got ready for bed, Charles found himself thinking about Heinrich Hoffman and the farm that would soon be turned into a shopping center. He thought about the 12 public works employees who would lose their jobs when waste management was privatized. He thought about Susan Walsh, who had no idea that her long-standing contract with the town was about to be put out for competitive bidding. These were real people whose lives would be affected by the decisions made tonight. That was what public service was supposed to be about, Charles reminded himself. It wasn't about political maneuvering or personal relationships or even friendship. It was about making decisions that served the broader community, even when those decisions were difficult or unpopular. As he lay in bed next to his sleeping wife, Charles made a silent promise to himself. Whatever was happening with the council, whatever coordination or planning was taking place without his knowledge, he would continue to do what he thought was right for the people of Millfield. He had been elected to represent their interests, not to rubber-stamp decisions made behind closed doors. He had no way of knowing that this promise would soon test every relationship he valued, cost him friendships he had treasured for decades, and ultimately lead him to that terrible moment when everything would finally fall apart. But even if he had known, Charles Morrison was the kind of man who would have made the same promise. It was who he was, and it was about to become both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. The morning after the council meeting, Charles woke up with the same uneasy feeling that had followed him home the night before. Sarah was already gone, having left early for her job at the regional hospital where she worked as a nurse manager. A note on the kitchen counter reminded him about Emma's upcoming spring break and asked him to call the contractor about the leaking roof in the garage. Normal domestic concerns, the kind of everyday details that usually grounded him after difficult council meetings. But today felt different. As Charles sat at his kitchen table with his coffee and the morning newspaper, he couldn't shake the sense that something important had changed last night. The decisions themselves were significant, but what troubled him more was the feeling that he had been deliberately excluded from the real decision-making process. His phone rang at 8:30, earlier than he usually received calls at home. The caller ID showed Margaret Chen's number, and Charles answered with some concern. Margaret rarely called him directly, preferring to discuss library issues during public comment at council meetings. "Charles, I'm sorry to bother you at home," Margaret said, her voice tight with worry, "but I wanted to talk to you about something before I decide whether to bring it up publicly." "Of course, Margaret. What's on your mind?"
It's about the library budget.
"I've been hearing rumors that there might be significant cuts proposed for next year, but no one has said anything official. I was hoping you might know something about what's being planned." Charles frowned. The library budget had been stable for years, and he hadn't heard any discussion about cuts. "I haven't heard anything about that, Margaret. Where are you getting this information?"
Well, that's the strange part.
My source was Jennifer Martinez. She approached me after last night's meeting and suggested that I might want to start preparing for some difficult budget discussions. She said the council was looking at all non-essential services for potential cost savings. The phrase non-essential services made Charles angry. The library was hardly non-essential. It served thousands of residents every month, provided computer access for job seekers, offered after-school programs for children, and served as a community gathering place for everything from book clubs to voter registration drives. Margaret, I can assure you that any significant budget changes would be discussed by the full council before any decisions are made. If Jennifer mentioned this to you, She was either speculating or she knows something that hasn't been shared with all council members. That's what I was afraid of, Margaret said quietly. Charles, can I ask you something? Last night, during the meeting, it seemed like you were the only one asking tough questions about those proposals. Is everything okay with the council? It was a perceptive question, and Charles found himself wishing he had a clear answer. I think there may be some communication issues that need to be worked out, he said carefully. But I want you to know that I'll always fight for library funding. The library is one of our community's most valuable resources. After hanging up with Margaret, Charles decided to call David Walsh directly. If there was some kind of coordination happening among council members, David would know about it. They had been friends for too long for David to lie to him outright. David's secretary said he was in a meeting but would call back within the hour. While Charles waited, he decided to do some research on the companies and proposals that had been discussed the night before. He had learned over the years that information was power in local politics, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that he was operating with incomplete information. His research into precision waste management revealed some troubling details. The company had been involved in several controversies in neighboring communities, including a lawsuit over allegations of price fixing and complaints about inadequate service during a severe winter storm. More concerning was the pattern Charles discovered in the company's bidding practices. Precision consistently submitted low initial bids to win contracts, then raised prices significantly during renewal negotiations. Charles also looked more closely at the proposed development on the Hoffman farm. The developer, Morrison Properties, was owned by a consortium of investors that included several prominent names from regional politics and business. One of those names was familiar to Charles, Robert Kellerman, the same person who owned Precision Waste Management and had donated to Jennifer Martinez's campaign. The web of connections was beginning to concern Charles. It was possible that these were simply coincidences, that successful business people in the region naturally ended up involved in multiple ventures. But the pattern suggested something more coordinated, and Charles's experience in local politics had taught him to be suspicious of patterns. David called back just before noon, and Charles could hear the strain in his old friend's voice. Sorry I couldn't talk earlier, David said. It's been a crazy morning. What can I do for you? David, I wanted to talk to you about last night. I felt like I was missing something, like there had been discussions about those agenda items that I wasn't part of. There was a pause before David responded. Charles, you know how these things work. Council members talk to each other between meetings. We discuss issues, share information, try to build consensus. It's not unusual, but it is unusual for me to be completely left out of those discussions. We've been doing this together for 15 years, David. Since when do you build consensus without talking to me? Another pause, longer this time. Maybe we assumed you wouldn't be interested in some of these preliminary conversations. You've been pretty vocal about your opposition to development projects lately. Charles felt a flash of anger. My opposition to bad development projects, David. I've supported plenty of good ones, but I've never been excluded from discussions just because people assumed I wouldn't like their conclusions. Look, Charles, maybe we need to sit down and talk about this in person. There are some things happening that are bigger than any individual agenda item. Why don't we have lunch tomorrow? Just the two of us, like old times. Charles agreed to the lunch meeting, but he hung up feeling more troubled than before. David's tone had been defensive, almost evasive. These were not characteristics Charles associated with his longtime friend. The rest of the day brought a series of phone calls from residents who had attended the previous night's meeting. Some callers supported the decisions that had been made, particularly the economic development aspects of the Hoffman farm rezoning, but others expressed concerns similar to Charles's own doubts. Heinrich Hoffman called in the early afternoon, his voice shaky with age and emotion. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to thank you for speaking up last night. I know it didn't change anything, but it meant something to me that someone on the council understood what this land means to my family. I'm sorry the vote didn't go your way, Mr. Hoffman. I know how much that farm means to you. It's not just about me, the old man said. It's about what kind of community we want Millfield to be. Once you start turning farmland into shopping centers, where does it end? Pretty soon, there won't be anything left of the town I grew up in. Charles found himself thinking about Heinrich's words long after the call ended. Change was inevitable in any community, and not all change was bad. But the pace and nature of the changes being proposed for Millfield seemed to be accelerating. And Charles was beginning to wonder whether the community was driving that change or simply being swept along by it. That evening, Charles attended Emma's soccer game at the high school. She was home for spring break and had agreed to help coach the junior varsity team as a volunteer. Watching his daughter work with the younger players reminded Charles of why he had gotten involved in local politics in the first place. He wanted Millfield to be the kind of community where young people like Emma would want to return and raise their own families. After the game, Emma joined Charles for ice cream at Morrison's Dairy Bar, a local institution that had been serving the community for over 50 years. The owner, Pete Morrison, was no relation to Charles despite sharing the same last name, but he had become a friend over the years. "Dad, you seem distracted tonight," Emma said as they sat in a corner booth. "Is everything okay?" Charles looked at his daughter, struck by how much she had matured during her time in college. She was studying environmental science, but she also took courses in political science and economics. Her perspectives on community issues were often more sophisticated than those of his fellow council members. "I'm having some challenges with the council," Charles admitted. "There are some decisions being made that I'm not sure are in the community's best interests."
Like what?
Charles explained the previous night's meetings, being careful not to be too critical of his colleagues. Emma listened thoughtfully, asking occasional questions that showed she understood both the political and practical implications of the decisions.
Dad, can I ask you something? Do you think maybe you're being left out of discussions because people know you'll ask hard questions they don't want to answer?
It was a perceptive question, one that Charles had been avoiding asking himself.
What do you mean?
Well, from what you've told me, it sounds like these decisions would be a lot easier to make if everyone just agreed with them. If you're the person who's going to point out problems or raise uncomfortable issues, maybe it's easier for them to just not include you in the planning. Charles realized that his daughter had identified something he had been reluctant to acknowledge. "You think they're deliberately excluding me?" "I think people in power sometimes convince themselves that opposition is just an obstacle to overcome rather than an important part of the process. And if you're the person who represents that opposition, then you become the obstacle." Driving home after dropping Emma at her friend's house, Charles thought about their conversation. His daughter's analysis was uncomfortable because it rang true. He had always prided himself on asking tough questions, on representing the concerns of residents who might not have a voice in the political process. But if that approach was causing him to be marginalized within the council, what was the point? The next day's lunch with David took place at Giuseppe's, an Italian restaurant where they had shared countless meals over the years. David seemed nervous, fidgeting with his napkin and avoiding eye contact. Charles decided to be direct. "David, what's going on? And please don't tell me this is just normal political maneuvering. We've known each other too long for that." David sighed deeply, looking older than his 52 years. "Charles, there are some things happening that are bigger than local politics. There are people involved who have resources and influence that could benefit Millfield, but they need to know they can count on a cooperative local government." "What people? What resources?" "Regional development interests. Business leaders who could bring significant investment to our community. But they need predictability, Charles. They need to know that when they make proposals, they won't get bogged down in endless debates and opposition." Charles felt a chill of understanding. "You're talking about Morrison Properties and Precision Waste Management, aren't you? This is about making sure their projects get approved without too much scrutiny."
It's about economic development, Charles.
"It's about bringing jobs and tax revenue to a community that desperately needs both. Sometimes that requires making difficult decisions." "Difficult for whom?" "For the Hoffman family who's being pressured to sell land they don't want to sell? For the 12 public works employees who are going to lose their jobs? For the residents who are going to get stuck with higher waste management bills when Precision raises their rates?" David's expression hardened. "You can't save everyone, Charles. And you can't stop progress just because some people get left behind." "I'm not trying to stop progress, David. I'm trying to make sure that progress benefits the community, not just the investors." "Look, Charles, I'm going to be straight with you. There are people who think you've become an obstacle to the kind of development this community needs. They're not bad people, and they're not trying to hurt Millfield. But they have resources and connections that could transform this town, and they need to know they're working with a council that shares their vision." Charles leaned back in his chair, finally understanding what was happening. "They want me off the council. They want cooperation, Charles. If you can provide that, great. If not, well, there are other ways to achieve their goals." "Are you threatening me, David?" "I'm trying to help you, Charles. I'm trying to give you a chance to be part of something bigger than arguing about zoning regulations and waste management contracts." Charles looked at his oldest friend, searching for some sign of the idealistic young man who had once talked about using politics to make the world a better place. "What happened to you, David? What happened to the person who used to care more about doing the right thing than doing the profitable thing?" "I grew up, Charles. I learned that good intentions don't pay for road repairs or fund schools or create jobs. Sometimes you have to work with the system instead of fighting it. And if the system is corrupt, then you work to make it less corrupt from the inside. But first, you have to be inside." Charles paid the check and stood to leave. I can't do this, David. I can't pretend that what's happening is okay just to stay on the inside. The people who elected me deserve better than that. As he walked away from the restaurant, Charles realized that his friendship with David Walsh was probably over. They might continue to be polite to each other in public, might exchange pleasantries at community events, but the fundamental trust that had sustained their relationship for over 20 years was gone. That evening, Charles sat in his home office, looking at the files and documents that represented 15 years of council service. He had kept detailed records of every vote, every debate, every compromise he had made in service to his community. It was a record he had always been proud of, evidence that he had tried to do the right thing even when it wasn't easy or popular. Now he faced a choice that would define the rest of his time in office and possibly the rest of his life. He could find a way to accommodate the interests that David had described, to become part of the system rather than an obstacle to it. The alternative was to continue fighting battles he might not be able to win, knowing that doing so would make him increasingly isolated and potentially ineffective. Charles opened his laptop and began typing an email to Emma. He wanted to tell her about his conversation with David, to get her perspective on the choice he was facing. As he wrote, he realized that he was really writing to clarify his own thoughts, to understand what he truly believed about public service and political integrity. The email grew longer as Charles explored his feelings about the situation. He wrote about his disappointment in David, his concern for the community, his uncertainty about whether individual integrity could survive in a system that seemed designed to reward cooperation over principle. By the time he finished, he had written nearly 2,000 words, far more than he had intended. Before sending the email, Charles read through it one more time. As he did, he realized that he had already made his choice. He couldn't compromise his principles just to remain in the good graces of his colleagues or the powerful interests they represented. The people of Millfield had elected him to represent their interests, not to facilitate deals that would benefit outside investors at the community's expense. Charles sent the email to Emma, then opened a new document on his computer. If he was going to fight for what he believed in, he would need to be strategic about it. He would need evidence, allies, and a plan that went beyond simply casting dissenting votes at council meetings. As he began outlining his strategy for investigating the connections between the recent council decisions and the business interests behind them, Charles had no idea that his activities were already being monitored by people who had a significant financial stake in ensuring that nothing interfered with their plans for Millfield. The trap was being set, and Charles Morrison was walking straight into it. 2 weeks after his confrontational lunch with David Walsh, Charles began to uncover information that would change everything he thought he knew about local politics in Millfield. It started with a seemingly innocent phone call from Susan Walsh, the town's longtime attorney who was facing the prospect of competitive bidding for her contract renewal. Susan had called to discuss procedural questions about the bidding process, but her real concern became clear as the conversation continued. "Charles, I want you to know that I appreciate you voting against the competitive bidding requirement. I've served this town faithfully for over a decade, and I don't understand why my performance has suddenly become an issue." "Susan, as far as I know, your performance isn't an issue. That's part of why I voted against the bidding requirement. Have you heard something that suggests otherwise?"
Not directly, but I've been getting some strange calls lately. People asking about my other clients, my political connections, whether I have any conflicts of interest with current council members.
"It feels like someone is trying to build a case against me." Charles felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach.
What kind of people are making these calls? That's the interesting part. They're not from the council or city administration.
They seem to be from some kind of consulting firm or research company. They mentioned they were conducting due diligence for a potential client who was interested in municipal contracts. After hanging up with Susan, Charles spent the afternoon making calls to other service providers who worked with the town. The pattern that emerged was troubling and consistent. Several contractors and consultants who had long-standing relationships with Millfield had received similar calls in recent weeks. The calls were professional and polite, but they were clearly designed to gather information that could be used to challenge existing contracts and relationships. Charles's investigation led him to request copies of all contracts and service agreements that were scheduled for renewal in the coming year. What he discovered was a systematic effort to identify opportunities for change throughout the town's operations. Nearly every significant service contract was being scrutinized, evaluated, and potentially targeted for competitive bidding or replacement. The scope of the review was far broader than anything Charles had seen in his 15 years on the council. It suggested a coordinated effort to remake the town's operational structure, and it was happening without any public discussion or council oversight that Charles was aware of. Emma called that evening to follow up on the long email Charles had sent her about his situation with the council. Her response was characteristically direct and insightful. "Dad, it sounds like someone is conducting a hostile takeover of local government. They're systematically replacing people and contracts to ensure they have control over all the key decision points. That seems like a pretty extreme interpretation, Charles said, though he had been thinking along similar lines. Is it? Think about what you've told me. They've isolated you from decision-making discussions. They're pushing through major policy changes without meaningful debate. They're targeting long-term service providers for replacement. And they're doing all of this in coordination with outside business interests who stand to profit from the changes. Charles realized that his daughter was articulating something he had been reluctant to fully acknowledge. So what do you think I should do? You need evidence, Dad, and you need allies. Right now, you're just one person raising questions that people can dismiss as partisan complaints. But if you can document what's happening and find other people who are concerned, you might be able to create some accountability. Acting on Emma's advice, Charles began a more systematic investigation of the recent changes in Millfield's government. He started by analyzing the voting patterns on the council over the past year, looking for shifts that might indicate when the coordination between his colleagues had begun. The data was revealing. For most of Charles's tenure, council votes had followed predictable patterns based on the individual philosophies and constituency interests of each member. But starting about 8 months ago, those patterns had changed dramatically. David, Rita, Jennifer, and Michael had begun voting as a bloc on virtually every significant issue, while Charles found himself increasingly isolated. The timing was significant because it corresponded with Jennifer Martinez's election to the council. Charles had supported Jennifer's candidacy, believing that her background in business and finance would bring valuable expertise to the council. But now he wondered whether her election had been part of a larger plan to change the council's dynamics. Charles decided to reach out to Tom Bradley, the hardware store owner who had been a regular presence at council meetings for years. Tom had always been engaged in local politics, and he had the kind of street-level perspective that Charles valued. More importantly, Tom was someone who might have noticed changes in the council's behavior that weren't apparent from inside the process. They met for coffee at Bradley's Hardware on a Saturday morning when the store was closed and they could talk privately. Tom confirmed many of Charles's suspicions about the recent changes in local government. Charles, I've been watching council meetings for over 20 years, and something has definitely changed in the past few months. It used to feel like you folks were actually debating issues, trying to figure out the best solutions for the community. Now it feels like the decisions are made somewhere else, and the public meetings are just for show.
What makes you say that?
Well, for one thing, the quality of the discussion has declined. It used to be that council members would ask detailed questions, request additional information, sometimes table items for further study. Now it seems like everyone except you already knows everything they need to know before the meeting even starts. Tom had also noticed changes in the broader political environment in Millfield. There's been a lot more money flowing around local politics lately. Jennifer's campaign was much better funded than anything we'd seen before. And I've been hearing that there might be some well-funded candidates preparing to run against you and David in the next election. This was news to Charles. His own term wouldn't expire for another 18 months, and he hadn't seriously thought about whether he would run for re-election. Who's talking about running against me? I don't have specific names, but the word is that there are some people with serious money who want to see more changes on the council. People who think the current membership is too focused on maintaining the status quo. Charles found the characterization ironic, given that he was the council member most opposed to the recent changes. But he realized that from the perspective of outside interests, his opposition to their agenda might indeed look like defending the status quo. After his conversation with Tom Bradley, Charles decided to attend the next meeting of the Millfield Business Association, a group he had addressed many times over the years but rarely attended as a regular participant. He wanted to understand how the business community was viewing the recent council decisions. The meeting was held at the country club, in a conference room that overlooked the golf course where Charles had played occasionally with David and other community leaders. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different from the collegial business gatherings Charles remembered from previous years. The association's president, Karen Stevens, introduced Charles warmly and thanked him for his years of service to the community. But as the evening progressed, Charles realized that many of the business owners present had concerns about the direction of recent council decisions. Several small business owners expressed worry about the impact of the proposed shopping center on downtown businesses. The owner of Morrison's Dairy Bar, Pete Morrison, was particularly vocal about his concerns. Look, I understand the need for economic development, but this shopping center is going to have national chain restaurants and a big box store that will compete directly with businesses that have been serving this community for decades. How is that supposed to help the local economy? Others shared similar concerns about the privatization of waste management services. The current system works fine, said Maria Santos, who owned a small catering business. My trash gets picked up on schedule, the rates are reasonable, and if I have a problem, I can call City Hall and talk to someone who knows me. Why are we fixing something that isn't broken? Charles listened to the concerns without commenting directly, but he took careful notes. He was beginning to realize that the community support for recent council decisions might not be as broad as his colleagues believed. The most revealing moment of the evening came when Karen Stevens pulled Charles aside during a break. "Charles, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything okay with the council? Some of our members have been feeling like their concerns aren't being heard the way they used to be." "What do you mean?" "Well, for years, council members would come to our meetings, listen to our concerns, and engage in real discussions about policy issues. Lately, it feels like some of your colleagues have already made up their minds about everything before they hear from the business community." Charles asked Karen if she could be more specific about which council members she was referring to. Her answer was telling. "David used to be very accessible, but he's become much more formal in his interactions with us. Jennifer is polite, but she seems to have her own agenda that doesn't always align with what we're telling her. Rita and Michael are still friendly, but they don't seem to have as much influence over decisions as they used to." "And what about me?" Karen smiled. "You're still the same Charles Morrison you've always been. You listen, you ask good questions, and you seem to genuinely care about finding solutions that work for everyone. That's why some of our members are concerned about the changes they're seeing." Driving home from the Business Association meeting, Charles realized that his isolation on the council was not reflected in the broader community. There were people who shared his concerns about recent decisions, but they didn't have an effective way to influence the political process. This gave Charles an idea. If the current council majority was coordinating their activities outside of public meetings, perhaps he needed to do the same thing, not to manipulate the process, but to ensure that community voices were being heard and considered. Charles began reaching out to residents who had expressed concerns about recent council decisions. He organized informal coffee meetings at local restaurants, attended community organization meetings, and made himself available to anyone who wanted to discuss local government issues. The response was encouraging. Many residents shared Charles's concerns about the pace and direction of recent changes in Millfield. They worried about the loss of agricultural land, the impact on local businesses, and the increasing influence of outside interests on local decision-making. But Charles also discovered something more troubling. Several residents reported receiving calls or visits from people who claimed to be conducting surveys about local government performance. The questions were detailed and seemed designed to identify residents who might be critical of current council leadership. One of these residents was Margaret Chen, the librarian who had called Charles earlier about potential budget cuts. "Charles, I got a very strange call last week from someone who said they were doing research for a civic organization. They asked me about my interactions with council members, my satisfaction with local services, and my opinions about recent council decisions. Did they identify which civic organization they represented? They said it was the Regional Governance Institute, which I'd never heard of. When I looked it up online, I couldn't find any information about such an organization." Charles was beginning to understand that he was not just facing political opposition within the council. There were organized efforts to monitor and influence public opinion in Millfield, efforts that went far beyond normal political activity. His investigation took a more serious turn when he decided to research the financial relationships between the businesses involved in recent council decisions. Using public records and business databases, Charles began mapping the connections between Morrison Properties, Precision Waste Management, and other companies that stood to benefit from recent council actions. What he discovered was a complex web of shared ownership, cross-investments, and financial relationships. The seemingly separate companies involved in Millfield's recent policy changes were actually part of a coordinated business network with common financial interests. At the center of this network was a regional investment firm called Strategic Municipal Partners. The firm specialized in public-private partnerships and municipal service contracts throughout the region. Charles discovered that Strategic Municipal Partners had been involved in similar municipal reforms in at least 6 other communities over the past 3 years. The pattern was consistent across all these communities. Strategic Municipal Partners would identify municipalities with aging infrastructure, declining tax bases, or other financial pressures. They would then work to elect friendly candidates to local councils or build relationships with existing office holders. Once they had political influence, they would propose a series of policy changes designed to create profitable opportunities for companies in their investment network. Charles realized that Millfield was just the latest target of a sophisticated operation designed to extract profit from local government services. The operations were technically legal, but they represented a fundamental corruption of the democratic process. Armed with this information, Charles began preparing a comprehensive report on what he had discovered. He planned to present his findings at the next council meeting, hoping that public exposure would force his colleagues to reconsider their recent decisions. But Charles underestimated the sophistication of the operation he was challenging. As he worked late into the night on his report, he had no idea that his activities were being carefully monitored by people who had invested too much money and effort in their Millfield project to let one stubborn council member interfere with their plans. The trap that had been set for Charles was about to spring, and when it did, it would destroy not just his political career, but everything he had worked to build over 15 years of public service. The attack on Charles Morrison began 3 days before he planned to present his findings to the council. It started with an anonymous tip to the local newspaper about alleged financial irregularities in Charles's campaign finance reports. The Millfield Gazette, a weekly publication that had generally been supportive of Charles over the years, felt obligated to investigate the allegations. Reporter Jessica Hamilton called Charles on a Tuesday morning, her voice professional but concerned. "Charles, I've received some information that suggests there may be discrepancies in your campaign finance filings from your last election. I wanted to give you a chance to respond before we publish anything." Charles was genuinely puzzled by the allegation. He had always been meticulous about campaign finance compliance, largely because he understood that any financial irregularities could be used to undermine his credibility. "What kind of discrepancies are you talking about, Jessica?" "The information I received suggests that you may have accepted donations that exceeded legal limits, and that some of your expenditures may not have been properly documented. Specifically, there are questions about a payment to Morrison Consulting Services that appears to be related to family members." Charles felt a chill of recognition. Morrison Consulting Services was a small business that Emma had started during college to help local organizations with social media and communications. Charles's campaign had hired her company to manage his website and social media presence during his last election, paying the standard rate that Emma charged all her clients. "Jessica, Morrison Consulting Services is my daughter's legitimate business. She was hired to provide communication services at her standard rate. All the paperwork was filed correctly, and the payment was well within legal limits. I understand that, Charles, but the concern is about potential conflicts of interest and whether the payments were really for services or were a way to funnel campaign money to family members." Charles realized that someone had taken a completely legitimate business transaction and twisted it into something that could be made to look suspicious. The attack was sophisticated because it was based on real information that could be verified, but it was being presented in the worst possible light. "Jessica, I'd be happy to provide you with all the documentation about that payment. You can see the work that Emma's company produced, the invoices, the contracts. Everything was done properly and transparently. I appreciate that, Charles. But there are also questions about some of your other expenditures and donations. Can we sit down and go through your campaign finance reports together?" Charles agreed to meet with Jessica the next day, but he was already anticipating what she would find. Whoever had initiated this investigation had clearly gone through his campaign finance reports line by line, looking for anything that could be questioned or misinterpreted. Even if everything was technically legal, the mere existence of an investigation would damage his credibility and distract from the issues he was trying to raise about council corruption. That afternoon, Charles received a call from David Walsh that confirmed his suspicions about the timing of the attack. David's tone was formal, almost cold, nothing like the easy familiarity that had characterized their friendship for over 20 years. "Charles, I've heard that there may be some questions raised about your campaign finances. I thought you should know that the council will need to consider whether these allegations affect your ability to serve effectively. David, you know as well as anyone that my campaign finances have always been handled properly. This is clearly a coordinated attack designed to discredit me just as I'm preparing to raise serious questions about what's been happening with our recent decisions. Charles, I can't speak to the motivation behind these allegations, but if there are legitimate questions about your compliance with campaign finance laws, the council has an obligation to take them seriously." "What are you saying, David?" "I'm saying that you might want to consider whether it would be better for everyone if you step back from council activities until these issues are resolved. Maybe take a leave of absence until you can clear your name." Charles realized that David was delivering an ultimatum disguised as friendly advice. "Are you threatening to remove me from the council? I'm trying to help you avoid a public embarrassment that could damage your reputation permanently. If you continue to push forward with whatever agenda you're pursuing while these allegations are hanging over you, it's going to look like you're trying to distract attention from your own problems." Charles hung up from the call feeling sick to his stomach. He recognized the trap that had been set for him. If he backed down from his investigation of council corruption, the campaign finance allegations would probably disappear quietly. But if he continued to challenge the recent decisions, those allegations would be used to destroy his credibility and potentially remove him from office. That evening, Charles sat down with Sarah to explain what was happening. It was the most serious conversation they had had in months, and for a brief moment, it felt like they were partners again rather than strangers sharing a house. Sarah listened quietly as Charles explained the campaign finance allegations and their connection to his investigation of council activities. When he finished, her response was both supportive and practical. "Charles, I've watched you handle your campaign finances for 3 elections. I know how careful you are about compliance and documentation. If someone is making these allegations, it's because they want to stop you from doing something that threatens them. So you think I should continue with my investigation? I think you should do whatever you think is right for the community, regardless of the personal cost. That's who you are, Charles. That's who I married. I may not have been the best wife to you lately, but I still believe in the man you are." It was the most encouraging thing Sarah had said to him in over a year, and it reminded Charles why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. Her support gave him the strength to make a difficult decision. The next morning, Charles called Jessica Hamilton and provided her with complete documentation of his campaign finances, including detailed records of all expenditures and donations. He also gave her contact information for Emma and all the vendors who had provided services to his campaigns over the years. "Jessica, I want you to investigate these allegations thoroughly. Check every transaction, verify every payment, talk to everyone involved. I'm confident that you'll find everything was handled properly and legally." "Charles, are you sure you want me to do that? Sometimes it's better to let these things fade away quietly rather than drawing more attention to them." "No, Jessica. I want the truth to come out, whatever that truth is. The people of Millfield deserve to know whether their elected officials are honest and trustworthy." Charles's decision to cooperate fully with the investigation proved to be strategically wise. Jessica Hamilton was a thorough journalist, and her investigation quickly revealed that the campaign finance allegations were unfounded. Every transaction was properly documented and legally compliant. Emma's company had provided legitimate services at standard rates, and all other expenditures could be easily verified. More importantly, Jessica's investigation led her to ask questions about who had initiated the allegations and why. Her reporting revealed that the anonymous tip had come from someone with detailed knowledge of Charles's campaign finance reports, someone who had access to information that wasn't generally available to the public. Jessica's investigative instincts led her to dig deeper into the source of the allegations, and what she discovered was far more interesting than the original story. The anonymous tipster appeared to be connected to Strategic Municipal Partners, the same investment firm that Charles had identified in his own investigation. By Thursday evening, Jessica Hamilton had a much bigger story than she had expected when she first received the anonymous tip. She called Charles to let him know that she planned to publish a comprehensive article about the campaign finance allegations and their connection to the broader political dynamics in Millfield. "Charles, I think someone tried to use me to destroy your credibility, and I don't appreciate being manipulated like that. My article is going to make it clear that the allegations against you are unfounded, and it's going to raise some serious questions about who is behind them and why." Charles felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Jessica's article would clear his name, but it would also escalate his conflict with the forces that were trying to control Millfield's local government. There would be no backing down after the article was published. The article appeared in Friday's edition of the Millfield Gazette under the headline, "Campaign Finance Allegations Against Councilman Morrison Unfounded. Questions Raised About Source of Attack." Jessica's reporting was thorough and damning for Charles's opponents. She documented the connection between the anonymous tipster and Strategic Municipal Partners, and she provided context about the investment firm's activities in other communities. The article also included Charles's first public comments about his investigation of recent council decisions. He carefully outlined his concerns about the coordination between council members and outside business interests, providing enough detail to make his case without revealing all of his evidence. The response to Jessica's article was immediate and intense. Charles received dozens of phone calls from residents who were concerned about the allegations of outside manipulation of local government. Many callers expressed support for his efforts to investigate these issues and encouraged him to continue speaking out. But Charles also received calls that were clearly intended to intimidate him. Anonymous callers warned him about the consequences of spreading lies about respected business leaders and elected officials. Some calls were openly threatening, suggesting that Charles should be careful about his personal safety if he continued his reckless behavior. Sarah insisted that Charles report the threatening calls to the police, but Charles knew that local law enforcement would be reluctant to get involved in what appeared to be a political dispute. Instead, he documented each call carefully and shared the information with Jessica Hamilton, who was continuing her investigation of the Strategic Municipal Partners Network. The weekend brought an escalation that Charles hadn't anticipated. David Walsh called a special council meeting for Monday evening, ostensibly to discuss recent concerns about council procedures and public trust. Charles realized that his colleagues intended to use the meeting to defend themselves against his allegations and possibly to take action against him. Charles spent the weekend preparing for what he knew would be the most important council meeting of his career. He refined his presentation about strategic municipal partners and its connections to recent council decisions. He gathered additional evidence about the campaign finance attack and its connection to the investment firm. And he prepared himself emotionally for the possibility that this meeting might end his 15-year career in local politics. Emma came home from college on Sunday to provide moral support for her father. She helped him organize his materials and practice his presentation, offering suggestions about how to make his case most effectively to the public audience that would be present. Dad, remember that you're not just talking to the other council members. You're talking to the residents of Millfield, and they're the ones who ultimately matter. If you can make them understand what's at stake, the political pressure will take care of itself. Charles appreciated his daughter's confidence in the democratic process, but he wasn't sure that democratic pressure would be enough to overcome the sophisticated political operation that was working to control Millfield's government. On Monday evening, Charles arrived at the community center to find a larger crowd than he had ever seen at a council meeting. Word had spread about the allegations and counter-allegations, and residents were eager to understand what was happening with their local government. As Charles took his seat at the council table, he noticed that his colleagues looked nervous and defensive. David Walsh was clearly uncomfortable in his role as council president, fidgeting with his papers and avoiding eye contact with Charles. Jennifer Martinez appeared confident, but Charles could see the tension in her posture. Rita and Michael looked like they wished they could be anywhere else. Charles had no way of knowing that this would be the last council meeting he would ever attend as an elected official, or that before the evening was over he would be walking out of the chamber in tears, his career and reputation in ruins. But as David called the meeting to order, Charles felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in months. Whatever happened tonight, he was going to tell the truth about what he had discovered, regardless of the personal cost. The trap was about to spring, but Charles Morrison was walking into it with his eyes wide open, determined to fight for the community he loved until the very end. The meeting began normally enough, with David Walsh calling the session to order and asking for approval of the agenda, but Charles noticed immediately that several items had been added to the agenda without his knowledge, including a closed session discussion about personnel matters affecting council operations. Charles realized that his colleagues intended to use the closed session to discuss his removal from the council. He decided to force the issue into the open before they could retreat into private deliberations. Mr. President, I'd like to address the council and the public about the allegations that have been made against me and the broader issues they represent. David looked uncomfortable, but had little choice but to allow Charles to speak. Very well, Councilman Morrison, you have 5 minutes for your comments. Charles stood and walked to the podium, looking out at a packed room that included many faces he had known for decades. Margaret Shen sat in her usual spot, taking careful notes. Tom Bradley was there with several other business owners. Heinrich Hoffman had made the difficult trip from his farm, his weathered hands folded over his walking cane. Emma sat in the back row, her face a mixture of pride and concern. Ladies and gentlemen, for 15 years, I have had the privilege of serving on this council. During that time, I have tried to represent your interests honestly and transparently, even when it meant taking unpopular positions or asking difficult questions. Charles paused, gathering his thoughts for what he knew would be the most important speech of his political career. Over the past several months, I have become concerned about changes in how this council operates. Decisions that affect the fundamental character of our community have been made with what appears to be unprecedented coordination among council members, but without the kind of public discussion and debate that has characterized local government in Millfield throughout my tenure. Charles could see his fellow council members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but he continued. My concerns led me to investigate the connections between recent council decisions and outside business interests that stand to profit from those decisions. What I discovered is a sophisticated network of companies and investors that has been systematically working to influence local government policy in Millfield and several other communities. Charles outlined his findings about strategic municipal partners and its connection to the companies involved in recent council decisions. He described the pattern of political influence and policy manipulation that he had documented in other communities where the firm had operated. These activities are technically legal, but they represent a fundamental corruption of the democratic process. Local government is supposed to serve the interests of residents and taxpayers, not provide profitable opportunities for outside investors. As Charles spoke, he noticed that several people in the audience were recording his comments on their phones. Word of his allegations was going to spread far beyond the confines of the council chamber. When I began asking questions about these activities, I became the target of a coordinated attack designed to destroy my credibility. False allegations were made about my campaign finances, allegations that have been thoroughly investigated and found to be without merit. Charles gestured toward Jessica Hamilton, who was sitting in the press section with her notebook open. But the attack on my reputation was just the beginning. I have received threatening phone calls warning me to stop my investigation. Residents who have expressed support for my concerns have been contacted by people claiming to conduct surveys, but who appear to be gathering information for political retaliation. Charles paused again, looking directly at each of his fellow council members. I believe that some members of this council have been compromised by their relationships with outside business interests. I believe that recent council decisions have been made not in the best interests of Millfield residents, but to facilitate profitable deals for companies in the strategic municipal partners network. The room was completely silent. Charles could see shock and concern on the faces of many residents, but he could also see anger and hostility from others who appeared to support the current council majority. I am calling for a full investigation of these relationships and their impact on local government decision-making. I am calling for the reversal of recent decisions that were made without adequate public input or consideration of community impacts. And I am calling for the resignation of any council member who has allowed outside business interests to influence their votes. David Walsh's face was red with anger as Charles returned to his seat. Councilman Morrison, those are very serious allegations that you've made without providing any concrete evidence. Do you have documentation to support your claims? Charles had anticipated this challenge. Mr. President, I have extensive documentation of the connections I've described, and I'd be happy to provide that information to any legitimate investigative body, but I will not provide it to a council that I believe has been compromised by the very interests I'm questioning. Jennifer Martinez leaned forward in her chair. Councilman Morrison, I find your allegations deeply offensive and completely unfounded. You're engaging in a desperate attempt to distract attention from your own ethical problems by making wild accusations against your colleagues. Charles looked at Jennifer with a mixture of sadness and disgust. Councilwoman Martinez, the only ethical problem I have is that I trusted people I considered friends and colleagues to act in the best interests of our community. I was naive to think that local politics in Millfield was somehow immune to the kind of corruption that has infected so many other communities. Rita Kowalski, who had been Charles's ally on many issues over the years, spoke next. Charles, I'm very disappointed in the path you've chosen to take. We've worked together successfully for many years, and I thought we had a relationship based on mutual respect. These accusations are harmful to the council and to the community. Charles felt a deep sense of betrayal as he listened to Rita. He had considered her a friend, someone who shared his commitment to transparent and accountable government. Her willingness to defend the current situation suggested that she had been compromised as well. Rita, I'm disappointed too. I'm disappointed that people I trusted have allowed outside interests to manipulate our local government. I'm disappointed that decisions affecting the lives of our neighbors have been made in secret meetings and private negotiations, rather than through open public debate. Michael Torres, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Charles, even if some of your concerns about outside influence are valid, the way you've handled this situation has been destructive and divisive. You've damaged relationships that took years to build, and you've undermined public confidence in local government. Charles stood up again, feeling his composure beginning to crack. Michael, what's damaged public confidence is the realization that their elected officials have been making deals behind closed doors with people who don't live here and don't care about this community except as a source of profit. David Walsh called for order as the tension in the room continued to escalate. I think we need to move into closed session to discuss these matters privately. Charles realized that this was the moment he had been dreading. Once the council went into closed session, they would vote to censure him or remove him from office, and the public would be shut out of the process entirely. Mr. President, I will not participate in a closed session that is designed to silence legitimate questions about council conduct. These issues should be discussed in public, where the residents of Millfield can hear the arguments and judge for themselves. Councilman Morrison, you don't have a choice about participating in a closed session that has been properly called under state law. Actually, Mr. President, I do have a choice. Charles gathered his papers and stood to leave the council table. As he did, he looked out at the audience one final time. He saw faces that reflected confusion, concern, anger, and disappointment. These were his neighbors, people he had tried to serve faithfully for 15 years. Many of them were clearly struggling to understand how their local government had become so dysfunctional. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that everything I've said tonight is true. I have documented evidence of the connections I've described, and I encourage you to demand that evidence from any future investigation. Don't let them sweep these issues under the rug in closed session meetings where you can't see what's happening. As Charles walked toward the exit, David called after him. Charles, if you leave now, there will be consequences. We'll have no choice but to consider your abandonment of your duties as grounds for removal from office. Charles paused at the door and turned back one final time. He looked at David Walsh, his oldest friend, the person who had been best man at his wedding and godfather to his daughter. The pain of their destroyed friendship was almost unbearable. David, the consequences began months ago, when you decided that maintaining power was more important than maintaining principles. I won't be part of a government that serves outside interests rather than the people who elected us. As Charles reached for the door handle, he felt the weight of 15 years of public service pressing down on him. All the meetings, all the debates, all the difficult decisions and late nights and thankless work, it was all ending in failure and betrayal and broken friendships. The tears started then, hot and unexpected. The kind of tears that come from a place deeper than disappointment or anger. They were tears of grief, for the loss of trust and friendship, and the naive belief that good intentions were enough to protect democracy from the corrosive influence of money and power. Charles heard his voice break as he whispered the words that would end his political career. It's over. He pushed through the door and walked quickly through the lobby, past the displays about Millfield's history and the photographs of previous council members who had served the community with honor and integrity. Emma was waiting for him outside, having slipped out of the meeting when she saw him preparing to leave. "Dad, I'm proud of you," she said, putting her arms around him. "You did the right thing." Charles held his daughter close, drawing strength from her presence. "Did I? I feel like I failed everyone who trusted me to fight for them." "You didn't fail, Dad. You exposed the truth. That's all any honest person can do." As they drove home through the quiet streets of Millfield, Charles thought about what would happen next. The council would probably vote to remove him from office, claiming that he had abandoned his responsibilities. The media coverage would focus on the dramatic confrontation rather than the substantive issues he had raised. His opponents would portray him as a disgruntled politician who couldn't accept being outvoted by his colleagues. But Charles also knew that some residents had heard his message and would continue asking questions about the changes in their local government. Jessica Hamilton would continue investigating the Strategic Municipal Partners Network. Tom Bradley and other business owners would pay closer attention to council decisions and their impact on the community. The fight for honest local government in Millfield wasn't over, even if Charles's part in it had ended. Democracy was messy and imperfect, but it was resilient. As long as people like Emma and Jessica and Margaret Chen and Tom Bradley cared enough to stay engaged, there was hope that the community could reclaim its government from the forces that had captured it. 3 days later, the Millfield Council voted 4-0 to remove Charles Morrison from office for abandonment of duties and conduct detrimental to the effective operation of local government. The vote was taken in closed session with no public discussion or input. The official announcement was brief and clinical, providing no details about the reasons for Charles's removal or the circumstances that led to his departure from the council meeting. Most residents learned about the decision through a short article in the Millfield Gazette that focused on the procedural aspects of the removal rather than the underlying issues that had led to the crisis. But the story didn't end there. Within weeks of Charles's removal, several developments validated his concerns about outside influence on local government. Heinrich Hoffman died suddenly, and his children sold the family farm to Morrison Properties within days of the funeral at a price significantly below its appraised value. The promised jobs at the new shopping center turned out to be mostly part-time retail positions with no benefits. Precision Waste Management began missing collections and raised rates within 6 months of taking over the town's waste management contract. Jessica Hamilton continued her investigation of Strategic Municipal Partners and eventually published a series of articles that exposed the firm's activities in multiple communities. Her reporting led to state-level investigations and new legislation designed to increase transparency in local government contracting. Charles never ran for office again, but he remained active in community affairs. He started a citizen watchdog organization that monitored council meetings and published regular reports on local government activities. He also began speaking to civic groups in other communities about the importance of citizen engagement in local politics. Emma finished college and returned to Millfield, where she started a consulting business focused on helping community organizations use technology to increase civic participation. She often told people that her father's experience had taught her that democracy requires constant vigilance and active participation from ordinary citizens. Sarah and Charles slowly rebuilt their relationship, finding their way back to each other through shared concern for their community and their daughter. They never talked directly about the difficult years when their marriage had seemed to be failing, but they both understood that Charles's crisis had reminded them of what they valued most about each other. The Millfield that Charles had fought for was never fully restored. The shopping center was built, downtown businesses struggled to compete, and local government continued to be influenced by outside interests. But the community was more aware and engaged than it had been before Charles's dramatic exit from the council chamber. Years later, when people talked about that night when Charles Morrison walked out of the council meeting in tears, they remembered different things. Some remembered the accusations and the broken friendships and the ugly end to a distinguished career in public service. Others remembered the courage it took to speak truth to power, even when doing so meant sacrificing everything he had worked to build. But everyone who was there remembered the moment when Charles Morrison whispered, "It's over," as he walked through that door for the last time. Some heard it as the defeated words of a broken man. Others heard it as a promise that the old way of doing business in Millfield was finished, and that citizens would no longer accept government that served interests other than their own. In the end, perhaps both interpretations were correct. Charles Morrison's political career was indeed over, but his willingness to sacrifice that career for his principles had planted seeds that would continue to grow long after he had left the stage. Sometimes the most important victories in democracy come not from winning elections or passing legislation, but from having the courage to say no when everyone around you is saying yes. The shocking moment when Charles exited the council in tears, his whispered words echoing through the chamber, became a turning point not just for one man's career, but for an entire community's understanding of what it means to participate in democratic government. It was over, but in ending, it had also begun something new.